For example, Mike Henderson had been operating 18-wheelers for more than 15 years when he came across something that caused him to reevaluate all of his preconceived notions about the highways he traversed. Mike was traveling on Interstate 40 in March 2019 to transport a shipment of electronics from Phoenix to Chicago. What began as an ordinary cross-country haul would turn into the scariest thing he had ever experienced. Around 2 a.m., the first indication that anything was off appeared. In the vicinity of Flagstaff, Arizona, Mike saw headlights in his mirrors that appeared to be following him at an odd distance when he was driving down a particularly lonely section of the highway. Even when Mike changed his pace, the car remained precisely 3 car lengths behind, never approaching or reversing. Of course, Mike didn't give it much thought at first. Perhaps he was being used as a pace car by another trucker, or perhaps someone was simply using cruise control to keep a constant speed. However, the conduct grew more peculiar as the miles passed. The lights dimmed when Mike decelerated for construction zones. They accelerated when he accelerated on open areas. They changed lanes a few seconds after he did. Mike chose to put his notion to the test after driving in unison for around 40 miles. Anticipating the car, he stopped into a rest area close to Winona, Arizona, either to pull in or to go by. Rather, the headlights just vanished. For 20 minutes, Mike remained in his taxi, looking across the parking lot and the highway beyond. But he couldn't find the car that had been pursuing him. Mike dismissed it as a coincidence and resumed driving. The headlights reappeared in his mirrors within 10 minutes, staying at the exact same distance. Mike was resolved to see his enigmatic companion more closely this time. He tried to see the vehicle's details by adjusting his mirrors. However, they were unable to discern the make, model, or even the basic form of the automobile behind them, due to the extreme glare produced by the headlights. The more Mike traveled east into New Mexico, the more the psychological pressure increased. The lights were there, relentless in their chase, each time he looked in his mirrors. He made every effort to shake his tail that he could think of. He made abrupt lane changes, drastically changed his speed, took unanticipated detours, and then looped back onto the highway. Nothing was successful. The car appeared to know exactly what he would do. Mike was quite terrified by the time he arrived in Albuquerque. He contacted his dispatcher after pulling into a big truck stop and parking under the brightest lights he could find. "I think someone is trying to follow me," Jim remarked, to prevent his voice from trembling. "They've followed me every step of the way for more than 200 miles. Over the years, Jim Rodriguez, his dispatcher, has heard more bizarre stories from drivers. Are you certain it's not a coincidence? Jim, perhaps you are both going to the same place. I've tried this stuff in every possible way. This is not typical driving conduct. I'm being purposefully followed, but I can't see who it is or what kind of car they're in." Jim mentioned that Mike might be suffering from highway hypnosis or fatigue-induced paranoia, but he also urged him to get in touch with local law enforcement if he felt really endangered. "Mike, get some sleep. Something is seriously wrong if they're still there when you wake up." Every time Mike fell asleep, he found himself looking in his mirrors for those headlights. In the hopes that his enigmatic stalker had given up and moved on, he resumed his journey after a restless 3 hours. He wasn't as fortunate. The headlights came back on after 15 minutes of departing Albuquerque. But something was different this time. Instead of 3 car lengths behind, the car was perhaps 2 car lengths closer. Mike's pulse began to race when he realized that whoever was behind him was turning into more combative. The problem worsened as Mike drove over the Texas Panhandle in the middle of the night. Occasionally, the following car would flash its high beams in patterns that seemed to be at random. It would occasionally revert to the 3C vehicle distance. On other occasions, it would get as near as a single car's length, close enough for Mike to experience the psychological strain of being followed by an unseen stalker. Around 4 a.m., the most unsettling incidents happened close to Amarillo. Monsieur Mike was traveling on a particularly remote stretch of roadway when the car behind him abruptly sped up and drew up beside his truck. Mike expected to see his pursuer's face as he looked down from his taxi, but instead he saw that the car's windows were fully tinted, darker than anything he had ever seen. Not even the shadow of a driver was visible to him. For almost 5 kilometers, the car paced his truck while maintaining a perfect alignment with Mike's cab. Then abruptly it fell back into its usual following position. Mike became aware that his hands on the steering wheel were trembling. Mike had been up for more than 24 hours by morning, kept up mainly by truck stop coffee and adrenaline. There were no indications of weariness or the necessity for fuel stops in the following car. As Mike traveled into Oklahoma and then Missouri, it continued to pursue him relentlessly. The mental toll was getting intolerable. Mike made a last-ditch choice in Missouri. After pulling off at a rest stop, he called the state police and told a doubtful desk sergeant about his predicament. "Did this car really threaten you or try to hurt you in any way, sir?" the policeman inquired. "They have been following me, though, for more than 800 meters. This is not typical conduct, unless they've made overt threats or committed a crime. We are limited in what we can do. Even if you follow someone on a public roadway in an odd way, it's not against the law." Mike was tired and frustrated, and he knew he was alone. He made the decision to try one more time to get rid of his pursuer by traveling around St. Louis via a convoluted network of back roads and exits. He took odd detours and doubled back on his route as he made his way through residential neighborhoods, industrial regions, and city streets for 2 hours. For a few hopeful seconds, Mike believed he had done it. His relief was fleeting as he pulled back onto the freeway and saw no evidence of the headlights. 20 meters away, they had returned, keeping the same eerie distance. The last stretch of Mike's trip into Chicago was a haze of fatigue and terror. An unidentified individual with unclear intentions had followed him for more than 2,200 meters. Mike pondered whether his ordeal would stop at last, or whether his pursuer would follow him to the loading dock as he got closer to his delivery destination. Mike sat in his cab at the Chicago warehouse, checking his mirrors as he backed up to the loading bay. The enigmatic car passed the building slowly, its tinted windows showing nothing, and then it vanished around a bend. After an hour of waiting, Mike saw no return. Mike checked into a nearby motel for some much-needed relaxation after the delivery went off without a hitch, but it was difficult to fall asleep. He jumped at every noise outside his room and every car door slamming in the parking lot. He didn't glance out the windows and kept the curtains drawn. Mike started his trek back to Phoenix the following morning. 15 miles outside of Chicago, the headlights reappeared in his mirrors, despite his belief that the horror was past. The same unrelenting pursuit, the same distance. The person pursuing him wasn't done yet. The journey back was much more destructive to the mind than the first leg. Mike was now aware that his pursuer could follow him all the way across the nation without showing signs of exhaustion or requiring long rests. The ramifications were horrifying. Who possessed such resources and commitment? What were they? Seeking? On the way back, Mike did everything he could think of. He made contact with before stopping. The vehicle asks security personnel to keep an eye out for his assailant. He took a variety of routes, including secondary roads and various freeways. He even thought about leaving his truck and taking a plane home. However, his business required the trailer to be delivered. Nothing was successful. Through Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, the car remained with him. It followed him past police checkpoints, through construction zones, and around accidents. It appeared to be exempt from the typical limitations that other drivers faced. On the way back, Mike had the most unsettling epiphany somewhere in New Mexico. He noticed that other motorists on the highway didn't appear to be aware that he was being pursued. As if it didn't exist, cars would blend into the gap between Mike's truck and the next car. Officers from the highway patrol would drive by, both cars without appearing to notice anything out of the ordinary about the convoy. Mike started to doubt his own sanity. Did he have hallucinations? Was he finally having a mental breakdown due to the strain of long-haul trucking? However, the headlights were constantly visible in his mirrors, unquestionably genuine, and in the same spot. Mike was a different person by the time he arrived in Phoenix following his 2,000th or 400th round trip. His nervous tic caused his left eye to quiver incessantly, and he had lost 15 pounds. The hollow-eyed, suspicious stranger who entered their home was hardly recognizable by his wife. Mike was not followed home by the following car. It vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, somewhere on the outskirts of Phoenix, However, Mike was aware that it was still out there, awaiting his next long-distance task. Mike never learned why or by whom he was being followed. He informed many law enforcement agencies, the Department of Transportation, and his employer about the occurrence. However, no inquiry was ever started. No license plate number, no physical description of the pursuer, and no proof of a crime were present. Mike quit long-haul trucking permanently within 3 months. He never drove at night again after accepting a local delivery job that put him within 50 miles of his house. He still refuses to talk about the specifics of those 4 days in March 2019, when something chose to follow him across the United States. There are many unsolvable riddles on the roadways, and the same unrelenting spotlights that plagued Mike Henderson are most likely following some trucker someplace. On the dark, deserted roads that link our cities, the monster that followed him home might still be out there, waiting for its next victim. Mike's story reminds us that often the most terrifying experiences are the ones that are impossible to verify, explain, or avoid. Every day, millions of people drive the extensive system of American roadways, but some interactions leave their victims permanently altered and defy logical explanation. The headlights remain in place, keeping a precise distance for the next unwary motorist to start their unrelenting, unexplained chase. After 12 years of over-the-road trucking, Danny Martinez believed he had heard it all. The job included CB radio talk, drivers alerting one another about road hazards, weather, and speed traps. However, Danny still remembers something. He saw on Channel 19 in September 2018 while transporting a load of construction equipment from Houston to Denver. It began on a Tuesday evening at approximately 11 p.m. on Interstate 27, somewhere between Locke and Amarillo. When Danny heard a voice that was unlike anything he had ever heard, he was listening to the typical CB traffic. It was cool, collected, and spoke with a disconcerting accuracy that instantly captured his pay attention. Going east at mile marker 47, Peterbilt was built. Your speed is excessive given the road conditions. Danny's eyes scanned the speedometer. For the clear, dry circumstances, he was doing precisely 65 in a 70 zone, which is completely safe and legal. He checked his GPS. He was getting close to the 47th mile. He had been mentioned in the voice. He keyed his microphone. It's that eastbound Pete, huh? Who is this? Here, I'm moving at a legal pace. Quiet. No answer. Danny assumed it was simply another driver forgot about it because they were being too cautious. The voice reappeared 20 minutes later. Peterbilt, you should inspect the tire on your right rear trailer as you head east. About 37 miles away, you will experience a blowout. Danny felt a shiver go down his back this time. The voice was aware of his precise location and the type of truck he was operating. Even more unsettling was the assurance with which it was delivered, which implied that the speaker somehow knew Danny's destiny. At the next truck stop, Danny stopped and circled his trailer, using his flashlight to check each tire. Everything appeared flawless. Good tread, correct inflation, and no wear or damage that is readily apparent. The trailer had only been inspected 2 weeks prior, and he was driving a virtually new Peterbilt with fewer than 50,000 miles on it. Danny attempted to ignore the experience as he got back on the road, but he couldn't get rid of the sensation that someone was observing him. Setting his CB to scan mode, he listened for any traffic that could indicate who the enigmatic voice was, but all he could hear was the usual driver's conversation about delivery schedules and fuel prices. Danny's right rear trailer tire exploded. Precisely 37 miles later, on a straight section of highway with no traffic, the blowout occurred at 75 degrees. Danny was able to bring the rig securely to the shoulder, but as he grabbed for his CB microphone, his hands were trembling. The failure was exactly what the voice had foreseen. Break 19. At mile marker 84, this is Peterbilt heading east. You warned me about that tire failure, and I just had it. Who is this? How did you find out? As though the unidentified speaker had been anticipating Danny's call, the response arrived instantly. Driver, you're going to require more than just a tire change. While you're down there, check your trailer brake lines. Danny's heart froze. He had made no mention of getting out to check the trailer or changing the tire. The voice sounded as though it knew exactly where he was and what he was going to do. Danny snatched up his torch and crept beneath the trailer to inspect the brake lines with increasing anxiety. His stomach dropped when he discovered what he had. One of the airlines was now on the verge of collapse after progressively leaking for days. He would have lost braking power to the entire trailer if it had failed entirely while he was driving, which might have been fatal on the upcoming mountain roads. "Jesus Christ," Danny said in a low voice. "This could have killed me." He waited for a mobile repair crew for 4 hours after he called for roadside help. He made several unsuccessful attempts to reach the enigmatic voice on Channel 19 throughout that period. Other drivers stopped by to see how he was doing, giving companionship and assistance, but none of them had heard the warnings that might have saved his life. The brake line damage perplexed the repair specialist when he eventually showed up. He said, "This is weird," as he looked into the connection. "It doesn't make sense that this was purposefully made weaker. Who would be able to enter your trailer and carry out such an action?" Danny was unable to respond to the query. He had parked his truck in a guarded company lot or at a security camera-equipped truck stop. The evidence was directly in front of them, yet it seemed unlikely that someone had tampered with his equipment. Danny's nerves were on edge as he continued toward Denver after the repairs were finished. He waited for the voice to come back, keeping his CB on Channel 19. It happened at about 3 in the morning while he was climbing through the New Mexico mountains. "Peterbilt, if you are heading east, please slow down right away. At mile marker 23, there is black ice up ahead." Danny's eyes scanned his GPS. The road looked fine, and mile marker 23 was still 8 miles away. There had been no precipitation for days, and the temperature was well above freezing. Danny, meanwhile, wasn't taking any chances following the tire and brake line problems. He activated his caution lights and slowed from 65 to 45 mph. At the 23rd mile marker on the highway, Danny came upon a section of black ice that covered both lanes. He was able to safely traverse it at his lowered speed, but he could see the skid marks of less fortunate drivers who had skidded off the road after hitting the ice at full speed. Danny said, "Thank you," into his CB microphone. "Once again, you saved my life. Tell me who you are, please." That same unnerving calmness characterized the response. "Danny Martinez, I've been keeping an eye on you. You're not even aware of the things I know about you." Dai's blood became icy. His entire name had been utilized in the voice, information that a casual observer could not obtain from his CB radio or any other source. His identify shouldn't have been known to anyone on the road. "How did you figure out my name? Are you keeping up with me? I am aware that you reside in Houston at 847 Cypress Street. I am aware that you and Maria have been wed for 8 years. I am aware that Sophia, your daughter, is a 3rd grader at Roosevelt Elementary. I am aware that you have a .38 revolver in your sleeper berth that isn't registered, and that you have $1,147 in cash in your wallet." Danny's heart was racing so intensely that he was having trouble breathing. Even the information regarding the unregistered weapon, which he had never mentioned to anyone, was accurate. Whoever was communicating with him had been monitoring his life and had access to extremely private information. "What do you want from me?" Danny was able to inquire. "I want you to pay close attention to what I have to say. You will be presented with an offer of employment that looks too good to be true when you arrive in Denver tomorrow. At the Flying J truck stop on I-76, you'll be approached by a man named Carlos Mendoza. Without asking any questions, he will provide you $50,000 to transport a shipment to Los Angeles. Because you need the money for Sophia's medical bills, you will be tempted. Danny thought he was about to get sick. Sophia, his daughter, had been 6 months prior. He had been diagnosed with a rare kidney ailment, and his family was going bankrupt due to the medical bills. Other than their immediate family, they had kept the financial burden a secret. How was Sophia's illness known to this stranger? "Danny, don't take that job. At a checkpoint in Arizona, you will be apprehended with a load of drugs. The next 15 years will be spent in federal prison, and Sophia will never receive the necessary medical care." Danny was left alone with his worries and thoughts when the voice fell silent. He kept trying to call back, but Channel 19 was silent save for the usual trucker chit-chat. In a state of obsessive anxiety, Danny kept checking his mirrors and wondering who was monitoring him during the remainder of the drive to Denver. The following afternoon, Danny was tired and suspicious when he arrived at the Flying J truck stop in Denver. He had been leaping at every sound and had hardly slept. He was filling up his pickup when a well-dressed Hispanic man smiled warmly at him. "Danny Martinez, are you? My name is Carlos Mendoza. I've heard that earning some extra cash would be of interest to you." Danny's heart froze. This encounter was exactly what the enigmatic voice had foreseen. Just like the voice had indicated, Carlos was providing a well-paying, question-free job transporting a shipment to Los Angeles. "I understand this may seem strange," Carlos added. "However, I have an urgent shipment that must reach Los Angeles as soon as possible. If I find the appropriate driver, I'm willing to pay $50,000 in cash." Danny considered Sophia's medical expenditures while she gazed at Carlos's amiable face. All of their issues would be resolved by the money. However, he had been alerted at this very moment by the voice on Channel 19. The voice's other prophecies had all materialized. After saying, "Thanks, but I'm not interested," Danny turned away. Carlos persisted more. "Dude, think about it. It's easy money. To go to Los Angeles, all you need to do is drive. No paperwork, no trouble." "No," I replied. As Danny watched Carlos leave, he wondered if he had just made the worst decision of his life, or if he had escaped being sent to a federal jail. Eager to return home to his family, he called his dispatcher and asked for a load back to Houston. Danny made several attempts to reach the enigmatic voice on the way back, but Channel 19 remained unresponsive. He was looking for answers. Who was observing him? Why did they decide to assist him rather than hurt him? And how did they know so much about his private life? He never received those responses. Danny never found out who his enigmatic sponsor was, and the voice never made a comeback to Channel 19. However, 2 weeks after coming home, Danny came upon a news story that made him feel really cold. Together with another truck driver who had taken the work that Danny had rejected, Carlos Mendoza had been jailed in Arizona. The driver of the vehicle was facing a federal sentence ranging from 15 years to life in prison for transporting 500 pounds of cocaine. Within a month, Danny gave up long-haul trucking. In order to be near his house and his family, he accepted a local job in Houston operating a delivery truck. He avoided interstate routes at all costs and never again used a CB radio. After saving Danny's life several times in one night, the voice on Channel 19 vanished as enigmatically as it had appeared. Danny was never able to determine if his guardian angel was a government operative, someone with access to amazing monitoring technology, or someone else entirely, completely. He was aware that someone had been keeping an eye on him and had a near supernatural understanding of his destiny. This person had made the decision to spare him from a fate that would have destroyed his family. Danny had experienced something that showed he wasn't as alone as he had assumed in the long-haul trucking industry, where drivers frequently feel forgotten and alone. Voices can still be heard across America's roadways because to CB radio waves. Additionally, another driver may be receiving alerts about hazards they are not yet aware of. It's possible that the voice on Channel 19 is still there, shielding drivers from unknowable dangers. Danny Martinez was always thinking about who had taken the time to save him from himself, and he never forgot that night. The interactions that save your life can often be the most horrifying, leaving you eternally thankful to a stranger you will never know. Interstate 80 had been driven by Tom Bradley. Over the course of his 20-year long-haul trucking career, he drove hundreds of times across Nevada. Between Reno and Salt Lake City, he was familiar with every rest area, truck stop, and mile marker. Because of this, the events of October 2017 rocked him to his core and ultimately led to his complete retirement from trucking. Tom was behind schedule because of delays at the loading dock while transporting a load of furniture from California to Chicago. At almost 2 a.m, he was traveling along the barren section of I-80 between Nevada's Winnemucca and Elko. Due to its remote location, this specific highway segment was well known among truckers. There are very few services and even fewer places to halt in 170 miles of largely deserted terrain. After 11 hours of driving, Tom was getting close to the legal limit. He could feel the perilous pull of microsleep beginning to impair his focus, and his eyes were burning. He had to get somewhere to sleep for at least 8 hours prior to continue, even though he was aware that this stretch of route lacked designated rest spots. Then he noticed the sign. Like any other highway sign, the rest area 2 miles away came into view in his headlights. Tom blinked hard, wondering if he was hallucinating from exhaustion, but the sign was real and plain to see. In all the thousands of times he had driven this route, he had never noticed a sign for a rest facility. Here, however, Tom was too exhausted to doubt his luck. Tom noticed the entry ramp to what looked to be a typical highway rest area 2 miles later. A tiny parking lot with room for perhaps a dozen cars and 4 or 5 trucks was lit by solar-powered lighting. A tiny brick structure that appeared to be standard rest area amenities stood amid desert landscaping and the customary educational placards about the history and fauna of the area. Tom turned off his engine and parked his trailer in one of the truck spots. There was a tremendous quiet. No other cars, no highway noise, just the Nevada desert's enormous desolation. Tom noticed something odd when he reached for his log book to note his rest period. His GPS indicated that he was parked in the middle of a desert that was deserted. The device displayed only sand and sagebush, with no rest space or amenities. In his own words, GPS must be glitching, Tom said. He had never had issues with the unit before, but he was too tired to be concerned regarding technical difficulties and chose to put his trust in his eyes rather than the electronic gadget. After climbing into his sleeper crib, Tom fell asleep in a matter of minutes. Strange nightmares, however, interrupted his sleep. In his dream, he saw that other trucks had pulled into the same rest spot. He could not exactly place the drivers, but they appeared to be familiar. These drivers were attempting to communicate with him in his nightmares, but their voices were distorted and muted, as if they were speaking through water. After 6 hours, Tom felt even more exhausted than when he had fallen asleep. He felt as though he had not slept at all because the nightmares had been so intense and unsettling. He made the decision to use the rest area amenities before continuing his journey as he got ready to resume his trek. The masonry structure was unlocked, and the interior amenities were tidy and well kept. However, something didn't feel right. Despite the heat of the desert outside, the air indoors was frigid and stale. Unusual flickering of the fluorescent lights created unsettling shadows on the walls. The restroom's lack of mirrors, just empty frames in their place, was the most unsettling aspect. Eager to get back on the highway, Tom made short use of the facilities before returning to his truck. However, he saw something that chilled him to the bone as he crossed the parking lot. Other cars were parked in spots that weren't occupied when he got there. A pickup truck that appeared to have been idle for years, an outdated 1980s automobile, and another semi-tar with rust marks and faded paint. Tom approached the other semi-truck and looked through the glass on the driver's side. He staggered, backward in disbelief at what he saw. The cab's driver was slouched over the driving wheel, perhaps dozing off. However, there was a problem with the man's look. His clothes appeared to be decades old, and his skin had a grayish pallor. The driver of the truck did not answer when Tom knocked on the door. Tom knocked more forcefully and yelled, "Hey, are you okay in there?" But received no response. The man's chest rose and fell in an unusually slow pattern, as if he were in deep hibernation, but it seemed as though he was breathing. Tom rushed to the old automobile in a panic and peered through the windows. Behind the wheel was another person, a woman dressed in what appeared to be 1970s fashion. Similar to the truck driver, she breathed slowly and showed no signs of awareness of her surroundings, giving the impression that she was alive but in a suspended state. As Tom attempted to make sense of what he was witnessing, his mind whirled. Were these individuals ill or deceased? In a coma of some sort? Despite being on a major interstate route, where coverage is typically dependable, he found that he had no signal when he took out his cell phone to call for assistance. Tom forced himself to stop panicking and determined he had to get back on the road right away. He didn't want to be involved in whatever was going on at this rest spot. When he attempted to drive toward the exit ramp after getting into his cab and starting the engine, his truck refused to move. The engine was operating as it should. Even with the transmission engaged, The truck stayed motionless as though kept in place by an unseen power. Tom tried everything that came to mind, changing gears, checking his brakes, and even getting out to look at his wheels for obstacles. It all seemed normal. However, his truck just refused to go. Surrounded by people who appeared to be in some sort of supernatural sleep, he found himself in a rest place that shouldn't exist. As the hours went by, Tom saw that none of the other cars ever moved either. The drivers did not respond to any attempts at communication and continued to breathe slowly. The sun rose and set, but the enigmatic drivers never moved, never got out of their cars, and never displayed any signs of everyday life. Tom fought to keep awake, fearing that if he slept off, he may become caught in an unending repose that was more like death than sleep, much like the other drivers. But after a while, exhaustion overcame him, and in spite of his anxieties, he found himself falling asleep. When Tom awoke, he heard static crackling on his CB radio. A voice spoke, but the words were jumbled and unintelligible. Tom became aware that the voice was calling his name as he paid closer attention. Bradley, Tom, Bradley, Tom, you must go now. Before the time ran out, Tom reached for his CB. Microphone. Who is this? You're where? As the voice got more distinct, Tom realized it was that of Pete Kowalski, a truck driver he had known for years before who had lost his life in a truck accident in 2015. You're in danger, Tom. Drivers who are too exhausted to continue are collected here. After you doze off here, you join it. Now, while you can, you must depart. Pete. Does that look like you, Pete? How can this be? Do not pose queries that you do not want answered. Simply hop in your truck and go. Don't turn around. Don't turn around. Keep going. Do not go back to sleep until you are at least 50 meters away, no matter what you do. Tom didn't require 2 reminders. He got into his cab and restarted his engine. The truck reacted normally this time. Tom's heart was racing, with fear and confusion as he sped toward the exit ramp. Upon returning to Interstate 80, Tom glanced at the enigmatic rest area in his mirrors one final time. It appeared dilapidated and deserted in the early morning light, a far cry from the immaculate establishment he had seen the previous evening. Although the other cars were still present, they now seemed to be abandoned wrecks that had lain in the desert for many years. For the next 6 hours, Tom drove non-stop, driven only by fear and adrenaline. He called his corporate dispatcher to report the incident after he felt secure enough to pull over at a real truck stop in Utah. The dispatcher added, "I've got your GPS tracking data right here, Tom. Our records show that you spent roughly 10 hours parked on the side of I-80 in the middle of the desert. There is only an empty roadway there, no rest spot." Even as he spoke, the details of what Tom had encountered appeared more and more unbelievable. Had the whole thing been a hallucination? Could it be that he had stopped on the shoulder and dreamed the entire affair because he was tired? However, Tom discovered proof that his encounter had been genuine when he examined the inside of his truck. Walking around the rest area had left desert sand on his boots, and his clothes had retained an odd, stale odor. Worst of all, his logbook revealed that he had been still for precisely the duration he recalled from the rest place. The events in the Nevada desert continued to consume Tom's thoughts as he finished his delivery to Chicago. He investigated the history of that section of I-80 and found something that made him feel really cold. Numerous truck drivers have been discovered dead in their cabs along that stretch of highway during the previous 30 years, seemingly from natural causes while they were asleep. The most unsettling thing Tom discovered was that other truckers have reported seeing a mysterious rest area in the same spot on internet forums. His own story was strikingly identical to theirs. A clean facility that didn't show up on any maps, other drivers who appeared to be sleeping but never woke up, and the horrifying knowledge that the location was some sort of trap for tired truckers. It was the last time Tom drove in Nevada. Within 6 months following the tragedy, he retired early and relocated to a tiny Oregon town where he runs a local delivery service. He has never used a CB radio since hearing Pete Kowalski's warning from beyond the dead, and he no longer drives at night. There is still a rest place. It looks to drivers who are dangerously exhausted, providing them with what appears to be salvation but delivering something far more evil, according to the truckers who frequent the internet forums. According to some drivers, they have seen the same cars that Tom described, with the same enigmatic people inside who breathe slowly but never wake up. Tom is aware that there is a rest station on Nevada's Interstate 80 that sits between death and tiredness and gathers drivers who are too exhausted to go on. They are stuck in an endless repose that serves as a warning to anyone stupid enough to push themselves beyond their limits on America's most desolate roadways. The individuals trapped there aren't really dead, but they are also no longer truly alive. Some rest spots provide a form of repose from which no awakening occurs, and the desert retains its mysteries. Although Tom Bradley was fortunate enough to get away, he is aware that other, not so lucky, have been the drivers. Whenever a truck driver is discovered dead in his cab from what appears to be natural causes, Tom questions whether the driver stopped at an unofficial rest area. Fatigue kills more drivers in the long-haul trucking industry than technical failure, weather, or accidents combined. However, Tom is aware that exhaustion doesn't always mean death. At times, it ensnares you in a state where sleep and death are identical, where the prospect of rest turns into a prison from which it is almost hard to break free. In his 18 years of driving, Rick Jameson believed he had witnessed every kind of trucker convoy. He had participated in charity races, funeral processions, and coordinated protests that spanned miles of American roadways. However, in November 2019, Rick came upon a convoy that went against all he knew about transportation, time, and reality in general while transporting a load of machinery from Detroit to Phoenix. Around 3 a.m, it began on one of the most isolated highways in the American heartland is Interstate 70 in Kansas. Coffee from the truck stop and the prospect of a nice paycheck at the conclusion of his journey kept Rick alert as he struggled to stay awake. Except for the occasional passenger car and the far-off gleam of approaching headlights, the highway was essentially deserted. At that moment, Rick noticed them in his mirrors, a line of trucks coming up behind him, their headlights piercing the night like a parade of ghostly machines. Initially, Rick thought it was simply a group of drivers, a popular practice among long-haul truckers who have arranged their schedules to travel together for safety and camaraderie. But Rick saw something strange as the convoy approached. Compared to the contemporary rigs that ruled today's highways, the trucks were outdated. Rick could see the familiar shapes of large rigs from the 1970s and 1980s through his mirrors, long-hooded Peterbilts, vintage-looking Kenworths, and Freightliners that hadn't been produced in decades. The front-end truck drew up to Rick's cab, and the driver waved to him like a trucker. Rick waved back, but a shiver went down his spine as he took a closer look at the other driver. The driver was dressed in a trucker cap and flannel shirt that seemed to be from a bygone period of highway culture, and his clothes appeared to be decades old. The driver's appearance was even more unsettling. His eyes appeared to be staring straight ahead without blinking, and his face had a grayish pallor. Rick attempted to make eye contact, but the other driver simply maintained the same blank, forward-focused stare without acknowledgement or recognition. 12 trucks, all older vehicles Rick knew from his early trucking days, made up the convoy. They traveled at precisely the same pace and in flawless formation, keeping each other exactly the same distance apart. It was the most orderly convoy driving Rick had ever witnessed. This level of coordination wasn't even found in professional military convoys. Rick picked up his CB radio and set it to Channel 19, anticipating the typical group driving banter. Rather, he heard a steady stream of radio traffic from the convoy, which chilled him to the bone. However, the voices seemed distorted and far away, as if they were emanating from underwater or from a far-off era. "This is Pete, heading east at mile point 394 on Breaker 119. There is an issue with the load security. Pete, copy that. Keep your formation. At the next stop, we'll check it. Leader of the convoy, when's the next stop? It's been 18 hours since we started running. The next stop isn't there. Until we get at our destination, we continue to roll. Where is it? Going? I can't recall where we were meant to go." Rick made an attempt to interrupt them. "Convoy, hello. The blue Freightliner is running next to you. Where are you going?" After a brief period of silence, the radio burst into overlapping voices, all of them speaking simultaneously in the same distorted underwater tone. On the radio, Who is that? Someone else is out here. He shouldn't be present. Get him to leave. Stop him from following us. Rick's heart began to race with panic. He wasn't going after them. They had overtaken him, and based on their radio conversations, it appeared that they had been driving for much longer than the federal rules permitted. No motorist was allowed to drive for 18 hours in a row. However, it appeared that these truckers were unaware of safety rules or brake intervals. The convoy matched the lead truck's speed precisely as it started to slow down. Rick kept up his pace, but soon he was overtaking the enigmatic parade. He could see all 12 trucks, keeping their order as they fell behind him when he checked his mirrors. Rick gave his CB radio another go. "It's the blue Freightliner convoy. Are you all right back there? You're lagging behind." Only one voice answered this time. Speaking with an authority that seemed to reverberate from decades ago was the convoy leader. "Son, you have to get off this roadway. From dark to dawn, this road is ours. We don't require company because we've been traveling this road for 47 years. 47 years? Rick answered. That isn't feasible. Nobody spends that much time running the same path. This is the route we have been running since November 15, 1972. Delivering the cargo we're carrying requires us to keep going till we get there." Rick had a surge of fear. November 15, 1972. In trucking circles, he had heard of that date previously. One of the deadliest trucking accidents in Kansas history occurred on that date. All of the drivers in a convoy of 12 trucks were killed in a chain reaction accident when they were caught in an unexpected blizzard. Rick promptly looked up information about the 1972 accident on his phone. His darkest worries were validated by what he discovered. On November 15, 1972, a group of 12 self-employed truckers had got caught in a sudden whiteout blizzard while traveling together on Interstate 70 through Kansas. All 12 cars were involved in a chain reaction collision after the lead truck lost control. There were no survivors discovered. The convoy had been transporting a variety of cargoes to various locations around the Southwest, according to the news reports. Although the drivers had united for safety during the hazardous weather, their prudence had finally proved to be their undoing. When Rick checked his mirrors once more, he noticed that the caravan was catching up to him again. The 12 vehicles remained in perfect formation, and Rick was now terrified by additional things he could see. There were indications of serious damage to the trucks, broken windshields that should have prevented them from operating, twisted trailers, and crushed cabs. The worst part was that Rick could see the drivers better now. They all had that in common: grayish face and expressionless gaze. Some seemed to have injuries that would kill living individuals. The head of one driver was cocked at an odd angle. Another had bloodstains on his clothing, which, although they were about 50 years old, yet appeared new. Once more, the DC voice of the convoy leader crackled across the CB radio. "Son, you're getting in the way of our delivery timetable. For 47 years, we have been attempting to finish this course, but we cannot afford no more postponements. What do you have with you?" Rick inquired, unsure if he wanted to know the response. The response was, "Christmas presents. Toys for kids who have been anticipating our arrival. We committed to delivering them on schedule. Furthermore, a trucker's word is his guarantee." As Rick became aware of the complete sadness of what he was seeing, tears began to well up in his eyes. While delivering Christmas gifts to families throughout the Southwest, several drivers had lost their lives. Their feeling of duty was so powerful that even death couldn't stop them from trying to finish their deliveries, even though they were carrying loads of toys and gifts when the blizzard hit. Rick heard voices shouting out from the other trucks as the convoy moved beside him again, carried by the wind itself but not over the CB radio. "Son, help us find our way. For so long we have been lost. The kids have yet to get their gifts. We committed to arriving by Christmas morning." It was precisely 47 years after the deadly crash on November 15th when Rick checked the clock on his dashboard. The convoy only showed up on this particular occasion, although attempting to finish the deliveries they had lost their lives making. "Where are you supposed to deliver the presents?" Rick called the CB to ask. The answer was from Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, and Denver. 12 distinct families, 12 distinct cities. For decades, we have been traveling in circles, unable to locate the correct exits. Nothing is changing on the roadway. Appears exactly as it did in 1972. Rick came to the realization that the interstate system had undergone significant alterations since 1972, including construction, new exits, and route modifications that would make it hard for cars from that era to navigate. Attempting to traverse a highway system that no longer matched their antiquated maps and memories, the spectral convoy had been stuck in an endless cycle. "I can help you," answered Rick, surprised by his own suggestion. "I am aware of all those cities' present routes. I can help you find your locations." For the first time, there was a sense of hope in the convoy leader's voice. "Son, you'd do it for us? Assist us in finishing our last run?" Rick considered the children who had grown up wondering why their gifts hadn't arrived, and the families who had waited for Christmas presents that never came in 1972. He reflected on the drivers who had perished while their obligations remained unmet, caught in a never-ending loop of attempting to finish their final delivery. "Follow me," said Rick. "I'll get you where you need to go." Rick led the Phantom convoy across Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona for the following 8 hours. At every target city, one of the trucks would separate from the group and vanish into the city, most likely to make a delivery that had been neglected for almost half a century. By daybreak, just the convoy commander was left, trailing Rick in the direction of Phoenix. The final vehicle started to disappear like morning mist as the sun rose over the Arizona desert. It was the last time the convoy leader's voice could be heard over the CB. "I'm grateful, son. At last, we can get some rest. We have finished our deliveries." The last vehicle vanished as the sun rose, and Rick saw it in his mirrors. Feeling emotionally spent from all he had gone through, he stopped at the next rest stop and sat in his taxi. He checked his CB radio, but the discussions he had overheard during the night were not recorded. Rick drove home to California after making his own delivery to Phoenix. However, he will never forget the night he assisted a group of deceased truckers in finishing their last run. Since then, Rick has traveled the same path through Kansas every November 15th in the hopes of running into additional disoriented motorists who might need direction to their ultimate locations. Though they are becoming less frequent, the Kansas Highway Police still occasionally receives reports of a phantom convoy on Interstate 70. The majority of drivers believe that Rick's assistance made it possible for the spectral truckers to finally finish their deliveries and find tranquility. However, Rick is aware that other convoys from bygone times may still be traveling unending routes, transporting undeliverable goods, and being led by men and women whose sense of duty outlasts death itself. The ghosts of truck drivers who perished while their work was still in progress haunt America's highways. And occasionally, on a gloomy November night when you're driving alone, you might notice their headlights in your mirrors, requesting assistance to finish a final run. Despite driving long-distance routes across the American Southwest, Rick Jameson has never again come across the never-stopping convoy. He is aware that they are at last sleeping. Their Christmas deliveries were almost half a century late. Families who had previously questioned why their gifts had never arrived may have discovered enigmatic packages on their doorsteps. Presents from drivers who didn't let death stop them from fulfilling their obligations. Over the course of his 22 years of long-haul trucking, Carl Watson has been through thousands of weigh stations. He was well versed in the procedure: wait for the green light, then get waved through or pulled aside for examination after pulling onto the scale. Like checking mirrors or figuring vehicle fuel economy, it was just another aspect of the job. However, when transporting gadgets from Portland to Atlanta in August 2018, everything Carl believed he understood about the highways he traveled was altered when he came across a weigh station on Interstate 84 in Idaho. Carl was traveling quickly through the eastern Idaho mountains when he noticed the well-known blue sign that read, "All commercial vehicles must stop." 1 mile weigh-in station. Despite having driven this road numerous times over the years, he was unable to remember a weigh station at this specific site. However, Carl reasoned that since new facilities were constructed on a regular basis since his last visit, the Idaho Department of Transportation had built a new checkpoint. With new asphalt, brilliant LED lighting, and electronic signs showing the most recent weight limits and rules, the weigh station looked clean and modern. The inspection office was placed in a modest building on either side of a single scale platform that extended over the road. Everything appeared to be official and very normal. After pulling his rig onto the scale, Carl waited for his truck and trailer to be weighed by the automatic machine. His overall weight, as indicated by the LED display, was 78,640 lb, which was well inside the permitted range for his axle layout. Instead of seeing the green light that would let him proceed, a red light flashed and a message appeared on an electronic sign. Send a report to Scale House. With a groan, Carl got out of his taxi. It was usually a time-consuming inconvenience to be pulled for a random inspection, but it was a necessary aspect of the company. Anticipating a visit from a DOT officer who would review his logbook and vehicle inspection records, he walked to the Scale House. The interior of the facility was filthy and glaring, with fluorescent lights that seemed to buzz so intensely that Carl's eyes watered. A man in what looked like a typical DOT uniform sat behind a glass divider, but Carl found something strange about the way he looked. The officer had a peculiar pallor, and instead of making direct eye contact, his gaze appeared to be fixed on something outside of Carl. The officer said, "Driver's license, medical card, and logbook," in a monotone voice that seemed to be coming from a long way away. Carl gave the officer his papers and waited while he looked them over with remarkable care. As though reading something beyond driving hours and rest times, the man's fingers went mechanically across Carl's logbook pages. At last, the officer stated, "Your load weight is acceptable. However, there is another item we must verify." "What else?" Carl inquired. "All of my permits are up to date, and I abide by the hours of service rules." For the first time, the officer gave Carl a direct look, and Carl experienced a surge of discomfort. There was no iris or pupil to be seen in the man's eyes. Instead, they were dark pools that appeared to reflect the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Officer, we need to weigh your guilt," he replied sarcastically. Believing he had misheard, Carl gazed at the man. "I apologize." "What? You are guilty. Your conscience's burden. What's not on your manifest is the burden you bear." Carl's heart began to beat faster. "I have no idea what you're discussing. I'm transporting electronic devices. Everything is accurately recorded." The officer got up and proceeded to the secondary inspection door. "It won't take long, Mr. Watson. Follow me." Carl was tempted to say no to the officer's request to talk with a supervisor, but the officer's tone made him comply. He trailed after the man through the entrance and into a room that shouldn't have been in the tiny structure. It was a large, dark room with what looked like another scale platform in the middle. The officer said, "Step onto the scale." "This is absurd," Carl objected. "It is impossible to weigh someone's conscience. Nothing functions that way. Mr. Watson, step upon the scale. Or we may talk about the March 15th, 2003, accident." The blood in Carl froze. For 15 years, he had made an effort to forget March 15th, 2003. He had been driving in a snowstorm in Wyoming that night, struggling to stay awake after going farther than he should have. Even though he had just been asleep for a few seconds, it was sufficient. A family of 4 was being carried when his truck veered over the center line and collided with the vehicle. According to the accident report, Carl was not at fault. Because of the slippery roadways and poor visibility, the investigating officer determined that the collision was an inevitable result of the weather. Carl, however, was aware of the reality. His moment of inattention at the wheel, where he had fallen asleep, had permanently altered lives. "How do you know about that?" Carl muttered. "Everything is known to us, Mr. Watson. Every decision you make, every outcome, and every heartbreaking moment of regret. Get on the scale." Carl entered the platform with legs that were shaking. He had never seen a scale like this before. It displayed pictures rather than numbers. Carl was horrified to see his life's events unfold on the computer screen. The little girl who was paralyzed from the waist down, the family in the other automobile, and the accident scene. The officer stated that Sarah Mitchell, who was 7 years old at the time of the tragedy, was reading from a clipboard that had not been present just moments earlier. "She is still in a wheelchair at the age of 22. 2 years after the accident, her parents got divorced. The family was bankrupted by the medical expenditures. Carl's eyes began to well up with tears. An accident occurred. I had no intention of that happening. However, you were aware that you were too exhausted to drive safely. Instead of stopping to relax, you decided to keep going. Mr. Watson, it is a serious decision. A lot of weight. There were more pictures on the scale. Display. Carl's life following the accident, his heightened vigilance, his impeccable safety record, and his anonymous donations to spinal cord research. However, it also revealed the sleepless nights, the remorse that helped him, and the way he avoided the Wyoming highways where the accident had happened. The officer declared that the current weight of guilt was 847 pounds. This is more emotional cargo than is permitted by law. What does that signify? Carl asked, dreading the response. It indicates that you have been bearing an excessive burden. For 15 years, Mr. Watson, you have been transporting more than what is listed on your manifest with each mile you have traveled and each delivery you have made. That is a grave infraction. Carl searched the impossibly strange room for clues as to what was going on with him. What are you looking for from me? The officer looked at his clipboard once more. There are two choices for you. You can keep carrying this burden endlessly, adding to it every year and every mile until it overwhelms you. You can dump it here as well. How can I get rid of my guilt? By confronting the individual you have wronged. By taking ownership of your decisions and facing the repercussions rather than avoiding them. The room about from the sterile way station to the hospital room. Carl started to transform. As the police had stated, Sarah Mitchell, a young woman, now 22 years old, was in the bed. Under the hospital blanket, her legs were still as she read a book. The officer clarified that she is unable to see you. However, you can see her. This is the result of your moment of distraction. You've been bearing this burden. Slowly, Carl walked over to the bed and gazed at the young woman whose life he had permanently altered. Despite her situation, Sarah had developed into a lovely, intelligent-looking individual. Carl could see pictures of her college graduation on her bedside table, surrounded by family and friends who were obviously fond of her. According to the officer, she became a special education teacher. She assists youngsters with disabilities in adjusting to their restrictions. She might never have found a purpose if it weren't for the accident that took away her mobility. As Sarah closed her book and pushed herself into her wheelchair with well-honed efficiency, Carl watched. She moved with poise and assurance in spite of her infirmity. She was obviously someone who had figured out how to live in spite of her situation. The officer went on to say, "She doesn't hate you. She no longer even considers you. 15 years have passed since the accident. Since then, she has developed a complete life. You are the only one who is still dealing with the consequences of that night." Carl sensed a change within himself, as though a heavy weight had been removed. For 15 years, he had pictured Sarah as a helpless victim, trapped at the age of 7. His error destroyed her life. Despite her difficulties, she had matured, adjusted, and discovered meaning and purpose. Only those who want to do so can carry the burden of guilt. "You can put it down whenever you're ready," the officer stated. Carl decided to let go of the guilt he had been holding inside and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the display displayed a different reading and he found himself standing on the way station scale. Accepted load. Be careful as you go. At this point, the officer behind the glass partition appeared normal. A typical DOT worker with a professional manner and a friendly gaze. "Mr. Watson, everything seems to be fine. You're ready to go. Be careful when driving." After a few days, Carl felt lighter than he has in 15 years as he made his way back to his truck. He glanced in his mirrors for a final glimpse of the facility as he drew away from the way stop. But nothing was there. Only sage bushes and a deserted highway stretched to the horizon. At the next truck stop, Carl looked up information regarding way stations on Idaho's Interstate 84 online. The DOT website states that the place where he had stopped did not have a way station. It was 60 miles to the east of the closest facility, close to the Utah border. Carl, however, was aware that what he had gone through was genuine. For 15 years, he had been burdened with an excessive amount of guilt. Additionally, A weigh station that was able to measure things that couldn't be measured on any standard scale was located somewhere along the highways in Idaho. After making his delivery to Atlanta, Carl started the arduous journey back to Oregon. He traveled to Wyoming for the first time in 15 years, driving by the accident scene free from the crippling guilt that had been weighing him down for so long. Carl made a phone call that he had been postponing for 15 years at a truck stop in Wyoming. He asked a private investigator to locate Sarah Mitchell's most recent contact details. 2 days after learning of it, Carl wrote a letter expressing his guilt and how her fortitude and tenacity had motivated him to improve himself, rather than pleading for forgiveness. 3 weeks later, Sarah responded. She said that she had long since forgiven Carl and thanked him for his letter. In order to show him the difference she was making in the lives of disadvantaged children, she offered him to come to her classroom if he was ever in the neighborhood. Despite driving that road numerous times over the ensuing years, Carl was never able to locate the enigmatic weigh station again, but he is certain that it exists somewhere, assisting other drivers in unloading the invisible cargo that can weigh more than any actual freight they transport. Weigh stations measuring tons and axle loads abound on America's roadways. However, in Idaho, a facility that balances the remorse, regret, and conscience that some drivers carry for years without realizing how much it slows them down is located there. Even though he now carries a lower load, Carl Watson still drives vast distances across the western United States. He discovered that some goods are intended to be set down and left behind, while other stuff is intended to be delivered. He learned the difference from the weigh station that weighs more than cargo. Additionally, Carl will be appreciative for the remainder of his days. Everything had been dragged by Marcus Reed. Unthinkable in his 16 years as a self-employed truck driver. Equipment, electronics, furniture, and even animals. He did not, however, break one rule. He didn't inquire about containers that were sealed. He learned all he needed to know from the shipment manifests. Instructions for delivery, destination, and weight. The rest of it was someone else's concern. Up until September 2021, when Marcus accepted a lucrative job that would challenge all he believed he understood about the goods he carried, that policy worked well for him. Marcus was hired by Meridian Logistics, a broker he had never dealt with before, who offered twice his normal cost to transport a single container from a Newark, New Jersey warehouse to a research center outside of Las Vegas. The container could never be left unattended during transit, and the run had to be finished in 72 hours. That was the only catch. Marcus had asked the dispatcher over the phone, never unattended. How about relaxation periods that are required? It is illegal for me to drive for more than 11 hours straight. You can rest, said the dispatcher. However, you must remain with the truck. No motel, no truck stops. You sleep in your taxi if you have to. You must always be in close supervision of the container. The salary was too attractive to refuse. The job looked simple enough, and Marcus needed the money to pay some unforeseen medical fees. On a Wednesday morning, he anticipated picking up another standard load when he headed to the Newark warehouse. The location of the warehouse in an industrial area that seems to have been neglected for many years. The place seemed post-apocalyptic, with rusting fencing, broken windows, and weeds sprouting through fractured pavement. As directed, Marcus parked his vehicle at loading dock 7 and waited for his cargo to be brought out by the warehouse workers. Marcus had never seen a container like what came out of the building, although it had the proper size and form for regular shipping. This container looked to be constructed of a black matte material rather than the more common materials of steel or aluminum, substance that appeared to absorb light instead of reflecting it. No shipping labels, firm logos, or other identifying marks were present. Most disturbing of all, even though a forklift was used to carry the container, it was entirely silent. During loading, cargo would typically move and rattle. However, there was absolutely no sound coming from this container, as though it held nothing at all or something so tightly sealed that it was immobile. "What's in there?" Marcus questioned, the slender man operating the forklift, who avoided making eye contact and appeared apprehensive. "Above my pay grade," his response was. "I just load what they tell me to load." Marcus carefully fastened the container to his trailer, making sure his straps and chains were secure. The shipping manifest stated that the weight of the shipment was 34,000 pounds. significant, but not out of the ordinary. Marcus discovered, however, that his vehicle did not handle as he had anticipated for that weight when he drew away from the warehouse. It appeared that the container's center of gravity was different from its apparent mass. About 50 miles outside of Newark was the first indication that something was amiss. Marcus discovered that his fuel use was significantly higher than usual while he was traveling through rural Pennsylvania. His diesel use was almost double what it usually is. It appeared as though the weight of the container was exerting more force on his engine than it should have. To verify his fuel calculations and examine his rig for mechanical issues, Marcus parked into a rest area. He was walking around his truck when he saw something that gave him the chills. Despite the warm September weather, a tiny layer of frost had formed on the container. Marcus could see his breath fogging in the air close to the trailer, and ice crystals had formed along the container's borders. The total lack of sound coming from within the container was even more unsettling. Marcus had previously transported chilled loads, and the compressors, fans, and coolant pumping through the reefer units generated noise. Lines. The fact that this container could maintain freezing temperatures in total silence suggested that it was equipped with technology considerably more advanced than anything Marcus had ever seen in commercial shipping. Marcus got back into his taxi and dialed Meridian Logistics dispatcher. "I need to know what I'm hauling," he replied. "This container is behaving in ways that don't make sense for normal cargo." The dispatcher's response, "Everything is operating as expected," seemed like it was the end of the talk. "Go on to where you are going. Never veer off course and never leave the container unattended. However, what if a mechanical issue arises? What if I have to get repairs? No mechanical issues will arise. Mr. Reed, just drive." The phrase died, leaving Marcus alone with his rising discomfort and questions. There was nothing he could do but go on. He had already signed the contract and accepted the position. Marcus, however, couldn't get rid of the sensation that he was transporting something unsuited to the commercial trucking industry as he re-entered the roadway. Marcus was traveling through Ohio that evening when the second unsettling thing happened. After 8 hours of driving, he was getting close to his required relaxation period after he began to hear noises coming from the container. It sounded almost like breathing, rather than the typical cracking and settling of freight. Breathing in and out slowly and rhythmically, as if from several sources. Remembering his directions, Marcus parked away from other cars and stayed in his cab as he pulled over at a truck stop. The breathing noises persisted, occasionally overlapping, and occasionally synced like a choir of people sleeping. The beat seemed too natural, too intentional for Marcus to believe it was simply the container expanding and contracting in response to temperature fluctuations. The sounds shifted at midnight. Marcus started to hear what sounded like hushed conversations instead of breathing. He heard other voices, all in low tones he didn't quite understand. Although they were whispered so softly, the words appeared to be in English, and with such peculiar accents that Marcus was unable to understand what they were saying. In an attempt to feel less alone, Marcus reached for his CB radio and tuned into Channel 19, hoping to hear the typical trucker conversation. Rather, he heard a sound that made him shiver. His radio was now filled with the same murmuring voices that had come from his container. The voice said, "He's listening," over the static. "He knows we're here," someone else said. "Should we show him what he's carrying?" "Not just yet. We must first arrive at our destination." In an attempt to calm himself, Marcus turned off his CB radio and sat in his darkened taxi. The voices inside the container went on with their incoherent chatter, broken now and then by what seemed to be movement, not the moving of items, but the conscious and living repositioning of something. Every time Marcus closed his eyes to try to sleep, the voices would get louder, louder, as though the voices were reacting to his consciousness level. The sounds were hardly audible when he was awake and focused. However, as soon as he started to nod off, the voices would become distinct and persistent, talking about him as though he were a part of their cargo manifest. One voice said, "He's strong enough to finish the journey." Another person questioned, "But will he remain silent about what he's carrying?" He will. They always do. Their participation is guaranteed by the terror. Marcus remained up for the remainder of the night, counting down the minutes till sunrise while gazing at his dashboard clock. Desperate to finish this task, he started his engine in the morning and headed west. And never give it another thought. New horrors appeared on the third day of the journey. The container started to interfere with Marcus's truck in ways that defied physics as he traveled through the Nevada deserts, getting closer to his objective. When his real speed stayed the same, his speedometer would crazily change. His location would swing wildly on his GPS, putting him in awkward situations miles away from any roads. The most unsettling part was that when Marcus looked straight behind him, he started seeing things in his mirrors that weren't there. He was being followed by other trucks. Their drivers were dressed in clothes that appeared to be from several decades ago, automobiles that seemed to be from various times. Behind his trailer, they were all in perfect formation, acting as though they were a member of an unseen convoy. The following cars would disappear when Marcus would turn to face them or adjust his mirrors, only to reappear in his peripheral vision a few moments later, always in the same relative positions, always being driven by faces he could never quite make out. As they got closer to Las Vegas, the voices from the container became more animated, talking about their expected arrival with what sounded like anticipation and joy. Marcus overheard bits of speech that implied his cargo was not only out of the ordinary, but also potentially hazardous. We will finally have new hosts to work with after being stored for so long. The security of the research facility is really good. Nobody is going to obstruct our unification process. The trucker has fulfilled his function. When we're unloaded, he won't recall any of this. Whatever he was hauling wasn't just stuff, Marcus realized. It was something that was meant to take over the research facility's personnel. To make matters worse, it intended to obliterate his recollection of the whole incident, preventing him from alerting others to what he had given. Marcus made a choice that would follow him for the rest of his life as he got closer to the delivery address, a plain building encircled by tall walls and surveillance cameras. He drove past the facility and into the Nevada desert, not finishing the delivery. Immediately, the voices inside the container became agitated, talking quickly in overlapping discussions that Marcus could now fully comprehend. He's not going to quit. Why does he not stop? There's a problem. He is expected to take us to the establishment. We have to take direct control of him. Something was nagging in Marcus's brain's periphery. Not exactly ideas, but a presence attempting to sway his choices. He resisted the mental invasion by concentrating on his home, his family, and anything that was exclusively his. We are encountering resistance from him. How can that be? Some people are inherently resistant to our influence. Before choosing him to be our carrier, we ought to have tested him. It makes no difference. We can make him do it. Marcus felt his willpower being overpowered by something unfriendly and foreign as the mental strain mounted. Without his conscious control, his hands started to move the steering wheel, directing the truck back toward the research center. The voices hadn't foreseen Marcus's advantage, though, which was his familiarity with transportation laws. He activated his truck's emergency brake mechanism rather than directly resisting the mental control, bringing the rig to a stop. In the middle of the desert roadway, it came to a screeching stop. The container shifted severely on the trailer during the emergency stop. Marcus also heard sounds of impact coming from inside for the first time since newer. It was the sound of corpses hitting the container walls and falling, not the movement of stuff. The sounds turned into cries of anguish and rage. Marcus stopped trying to sound human and heard hammering and scratching coming from inside the container, as though whatever was locked there was attempting to pry itself free. The container sat lonesomely in the Nevada desert as Marcus unhooked his trailer and left. He could see the container moving violently back and forth in his mirrors, as though its contents were attempting to escape by sheer force. Marcus attempted to report what had happened by driving directly to the closest police station, but he was unable to recall important facts concerning the delivery. His account sounded like the ramblings of a tired, hallucinogenic truck driver, since the mental contact with the speakers had left holes in his memory. When the authorities looked into his statements, they couldn't find any proof of the abandoned container. They drove to the place Marcus had specified, but all they saw was a barren desert with no trailer, no cargo, and no indication that anything had ever been there. The fate of the container and its contents remained unknown to Marcus. When detectives investigated the Newark warehouse, it seemed like it had been abandoned for years, and Meridian Logistics had no record of hiring him. Like the container itself, all traces of the job had disappeared. Marcus, however, is aware of the delivery was genuine because of the things that followed him home. Unusual murmurs in deserted spaces, shadows that shift without any apparent reason, and the persistent sensation that something is observing him from a distance. Like a psychic parasite that feeds on Marcus's memories and gradually obliterates proof of their contact, whatever was in the container had left a piece of itself behind and bonded to Marcus. Marcus is aware that even though he will eventually forget all that happened, the presence will still be there and get stronger as his memories deteriorate. Marcus gave up long-distance trucking 6 months after the event in Nevada. But he understands that distance won't shield him from what followed him back from the desert, so he now works local delivery routes that keep him near home. Not all cargo remains delivered. It spreads over America's roadways by finding new hosts, carriers, and methods. The most hazardous item a truck driver can transport is the load that follows you home, since after you've moved it, you become permanently a part of its manifest. Marcus Reed is now imparting that knowledge to others, one hushed discussion at a time, after learning it in the Nevada desert. On a misty October night in 2019, Roy Hutchkins, who had been adjusting truck mirrors for 19 years, had never seen anything like what showed up in his driver's side mirror. Roy was traveling through Missouri on Interstate 44 with a load of farm equipment from Omaha to Little Rock when his mirror started to show him things he fervently wished would never happen. Around 2 a.m., the trouble began. Close to Springfield, Missouri in the morning, Roy was struggling through a dense bank of fog that had made it less than 50 feet visible. He was running cautiously and slowly, keeping an eye on the few cars that dared to go in such conditions with his mirrors. He saw something impossible in his left mirror at that moment, where there should be brilliant clear daylight have just been darkness and fog. Roy thought that his eyesight might be distorted by exhaustion, so he blinked hard and looked again, but the image was still there. The picture in his reflection was a bright afternoon with dry pavement and brilliant blue skies. There was no fog in sight, and he could see other trucks and cars moving at regular rates. His windshield, however, displayed the harsh reality of dense fog and almost no vision. "What the hell?" Roy murmured as he adjusted his mirror to check for any optical illusions caused by the angle. But no matter how he angled it, the mirror still displayed dazzling daylight, while the surrounding area remained obscured by fog and gloom. "Break 1N. This is northbound Peterbilt at mile marker 78, Roy said to other cars as he retrieved his CB radio. "Tonight, is anyone else noticing strange things in their mirrors?" A voice crackled back immediately. "Pete, native. It's just soup-thick fog out here. What strange things are you referring to?" Roy paused, aware of the absurdity of his response. "Never mind, it must be exhausting. Be careful when you drive." Even if it didn't make logic, Roy knew what he was seeing was genuine and he wasn't tired. It was a different time of day, or even a different day, in his left mirror. The mirror displayed the same section of highway in a totally different state as he drove on through the fog. 20 minutes later, the first forecast was made. In spite of the hazardous circumstances, Roy could see a red pickup truck speeding past him on the left in his mirror. Before vanishing into the ditch, the truck seemed to lose control and skid sideways across both lanes. Roy saw nothing but empty fog in front of him as he watched the entire tragedy unfold in his mirror. 5 minutes later, a red pickup vehicle that was moving far too quickly for the road was caught in Roy's headlights. Roy picked up his CB microphone. "A red truck is rapidly approaching from the south. You must instantly slow down. These roads are hazardous." "Mind your own business," was the antagonistic response. Just as he had seen in his mirror, Roy watched helplessly as the pickup truck pulled alongside his cab. By driving carelessly in the fog, the young driver, possibly in his early 20s, was obviously attempting to brag or prove something. The truck started sliding sideways across both lanes, as the mirror had shown. "Be careful." It was too late when Roy yelled into his CB. Just like Roy had seen in his mirror 5 minutes before, the pickup truck lost control and slammed into the median. The teenage motorist was shocked but alive when Roy pulled over and rushed back to assist. The man would live despite having a broken arm and possibly a concussion. He kept looking at his truck mirror as Roy waited with him for paramedics to come, wondering what other futures it might be depicting. Him. Even more unsettling was the second prediction. Roy's mirror started to display a picture of his own truck in a horrifying collision as he drove further south. He saw emergency vehicles with flashing lights, his truck jackknifed across the highway, and what looked like a body wrapped in a white sheet being put into an ambulance. Roy could see the mile sign, 156, even though it was still roughly 40 meters ahead of where he was now, because the view in the mirror was so vivid. On a prominent digital billboard, the timestamp read 4:23 a.m., which was roughly 2 hours in. The future. The realization that the mirror was depicting his own demise caused Roy's heart to race. The vision stated that at precisely 4:23 a.m., he would perish in a truck accident at mile marker 156. The accident site indicated that he had lost control in clear conditions, which was inexplicable, even though the fog in his mirror had cleared. Roy reported a possible issue with his truck to his dispatcher right away. "I need to pull over and check my car thoroughly, Jim. There's something off with the handling." The dispatcher answered, "You're already behind schedule, Roy. Is it not possible to wait until your next required vacation?" "No, it cannot wait. I have a hunch that if I don't thoroughly inspect this truck, something negative will occur." Roy spent the next hour inspecting every inch of his trailer after locating a truck stop. He examined the trailer connections, steering parts, brake lines, and tire pressure. Although everything seemed to be operating flawlessly, Roy kept seeing the scene of his own accident in the mirror. The truck stop parking lot and other cars were the only reflections Roy saw in the mirror when he got back into his cab. However, the prophetic visions came as soon as he was back on the highway. This time he saw a separate accident at a different place in the mirror. 134th mile marker at 3:45 a.m. Roy became aware that by pausing for the examination, he had altered his timeline and prevented the initial mishap. However, he was suddenly seeing a different future in the mirror, one in which he would collide at an earlier mile marker. His death appeared to be inevitable. His actions were changing only the specifics, desperate to know what was going on. After he had barely exited the truck stop, Roy pulled over once more and called. "This is going to sound crazy," he stated. The mechanic who responded, "But has anyone ever reported problems with their mirrors showing things that haven't happened yet?" For a long time, the mechanic remained silent. "Are you noticing anything in your rearview mirror?" "Yes. Which mirror did you know? Since other drivers have called about this before you. That section of I-44 through Missouri is problematic. For the past 6 months or so, drivers have been experiencing odd mirror sights. The majority of them witness mishaps before they occur. Have any of the mishaps really happened? That's the problem. Not one of them has. All of the drivers who have been contacted regarding the mirror visions have been able to steer clear of whatever they observed. It resembles the mirror, is demonstrating to them what would occur if they didn't alter their direction." Roy was both relieved and perplexed. "I'm not going mad then. Most likely not. However, you should be serious about what you're witnessing." The motorists who disregarded the alerts. Let's just say that a few of them failed to reach their intended locations. After expressing gratitude to the mechanic, Roy resumed driving. But he was ready this time. He would change his route, speed, or timing to avoid any accidents or dangerous situations that he saw in his mirror. The mirror appeared to be acting as an early warning system of sorts, presenting him with possible futures that he could avoid by taking cautious precautions. When Roy got closer to Arkansas, the most unsettling vision appeared. His mirror depicted him reaching his delivery location, a Little Rock farm equipment dealership. However, the scene was one of turmoil and violence rather than a typical delivery. Roy could make out ambulances, police cars, and what seemed like a hostage scenario. Roy would arrive at 10:30 a.m. and unintentionally drive into the center of an armed robbery, according to the mirror's vision. His truck would serve as cover for criminals, resulting in a showdown that would claim many lives. Roy warned the dealership over the phone right away. However, his call ended up in voicemail. Despite his best efforts, He was unable to persuade the local police to believe his report of an unreported incident based on images from a truck mirror. Roy chose to postpone his arrival instead. He paused for a long period of rest before taking a circuitous path through Little Rock that would take him in a different direction to the dealership. 3 hours later than the mirror had shown at 1:15 p.m., he eventually arrived and discovered police cars encircling the building. "What happened here?" one of the officers was asked by Roy. "Armed robbery this morning around 10:30, the arresting officer said. "When they opened, 3 guys hit the spot. It was touch and go for a while, but we managed to catch them a few hours ago." Roy's blood turned chilly. If he had stuck to his original plan, the heist would have occurred at the precise moment he would have arrived, just as his mirror had prophesied. He had stayed out of the crime scene by postponing his arrival. "Anyone hurt?" Roy inquired. One worker had a winged shoulder. "He'll be all right, though. Might have been even worse had things gotten out of hand." Roy didn't bring up the mirror visions during his delivery, but he couldn't help but consider the ramifications. Did he see a predestined destiny in his mirror, or did it offer him possible futures that he might alter? And why exactly was he experiencing these visions? Roy had one last glimpse in his mirror on the drive back to Omaha, which provided some answers to some of his questions. 6 months prior, he had seen himself on the same path. However, he wasn't by himself in his taxi in this vision. An elderly man dressed like a truck driver was a passenger, and he seemed to be giving Roy instructions and alerting him to potential hazards on the route. Roy identified the individual as Charlie Morrison, a deceased experienced driver. 6 months prior, in an accident on I-44 close to Springfield, Charlie has served as a mentor to younger drivers, always sharing his expertise on identifying hazards and driving safely. The image in the mirror implied that Charlie's soul was somehow linked to this section of the highway, continuing his duty to keep other drivers safe by using Roy's mirror. The accident forecasts weren't just arbitrary paranormal occurrences. Charlie used them to communicate warnings to drivers who required them. After that trip, Roy never saw the prophetic visions again, but he heard from other travelers who experienced similar things while driving through Missouri on I-44. Drivers were constantly shown accidents and hazards they could avoid if they heeded the warnings, but the phenomena appeared to affect different drivers at different times. Whenever feasible, Roy rerouted his trip to avoid that section of the roadway. He believed he had already heard the message Charlie Morrison was attempting to convey, not because he was terrified of the visions. The ghosts of drivers who lost their lives while attempting to assist others haunt certain highways, and occasionally those ghosts manage to carry out their tasks from the hereafter. Drivers who traverse the treacherous curves and fog-prone areas of Interstate 44 continue to see the mirror of tomorrow reflected in their cars. One vision at a time, Charlie Morrison continues to defend truckers, demonstrating that some guardians never stop keeping watch over America's roads. Although Roy Hutchkins still travels the Midwest on long-distance routes, he now pays more attention to his mirrors. Now being aware that they don't always only show what's behind you, he discovered that there is no set future. Drivers who are courageous enough to believe what they see and prudent enough to heed warnings can alter a number of options. Having a guardian angel watching over you through your mirrors may be the most important piece of safety gear a driver can have. In the long-haul trucking industry, where split-second judgments can mean the difference between life and death, possess. Over the course of his 14 years of cross-country hauling, Eddie Cortez had figured out how much fuel was used down to the gallon. His Kenworth's range on a full tank was precisely known to him. However, in December 2020, Eddie ran into a fuel issue that defied every physics law he knew while transporting Christmas decorations from Los Angeles to Chicago. Eddie had made the decision to persevere through the night because he was running late. He became aware that he had made a grave mistake while traveling on Interstate 40 across the Mojave Desert. His gasoline gauge indicated that he ought to have pulled over for diesel in Barstow, but he had been preoccupied and had neglected to fill up. Eddie's gasoline gauge now showed less than a quarter tank at 2 a.m. in the midst of the desert. Before his truck coasted to a stop, he might have another 50 miles to drive. Eddie grabbed his CB radio and called for assistance at the next Truck stop, which was in Flagstaff, Arizona, which was still 180 miles away. Break 1N. At mile marker 47, this is Kenworth traveling east. I need to know whether there are any truck stops between here and Flagstaff because I'm getting short on fuel. Through the static came the crackling sound of a voice. Ken, if you're heading east, there's a gas station on your right approximately 15 miles ahead. They have diesel. However, the place is small and easy to overlook. Eddie was relieved. Regards. What is the location's name? The sign just reads, Fuel, in red letters without a name. You'll notice it. After 15 miles, Eddie noticed a tiny gas station. It was a plain building with a single sign that read, Fuel, in fading red letters, just as it had been described. It appeared that the station had not been modified since it was constructed in the 1950s. Eddie turned off his engine as he approached the diesel pump. There was a great silence in the desert. Anticipating the standard credit card reader, he descended and went to the gasoline pump. Rather, he discovered an old mechanical. The scribbled sign on the pump read, Pay inside first. The store's atmosphere was like traveling back in time. An old man, who seemed at least 80 years old, sat behind the counter. The elderly man said, Help you? In a gravelly voice. I need to fill up with diesel, Eddie answered. How much for a full tank? The old man's pure blue eyes observed Eddie. Son, that depends on how far you're going. Chicago, I still have roughly 200 miles to go. Slowly, the elderly man nodded. It will cost $50, only cash. Eddie was taken aback by the low cost. His tank held 200 gallons, and diesel was costing more than $3 per gallon. Nowhere else would $50 even purchase 20 gallons. He wasn't going to argue with the deal, though. After giving the $50, Eddie made his way back to his truck. Squeezing the handle, he inserted the nozzle. There was no sign that fuel was being supplied, and the pump ran in total silence. Eddie could not hear or smell diesel, but the analog dial indicated that gallons were being supplied. Eddie checked his gasoline gauge after the pump signaled that the tank was full. Even though the process took less than 2 minutes, it displayed as fully full. When he returned to retrieve his receipt, he discovered the facility was deserted and dark. The entrance was open, the sign was off, and locked. Eddie got back in his truck and headed east, confused but stressed for time. Eddie's first odd observation was that his gasoline gauge was stationary. The needle stayed precisely where it had been, fully filled after 50 miles of driving. The gauge showed no change, even though Eddie knew he should have used at least 8 gallons by now. By the time Eddie arrived, he had traveled about 180 miles without using any discernible fuel in Flagstaff. Eddie recognized that something unthinkable had occurred at that desert gas station when the gauge continued to read full. Eddie made the decision to test his hypothesis. He drove east through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Illinois without stopping in Flagstaff for gas. Eddie never left the full position on his fuel gauge. Over 200 meters later, Eddie's gasoline gauge was still entirely full when he got to Chicago. He had not used a single gallon of diesel while driving half the way across the continent. Eddie headed to a truck stop to check his gasoline tank after finishing his delivery. Using a flashlight, he peered inside and saw diesel fuel at the standard full level. He attempted to test it with a dipstick, but it came out completely dry, as though there was absolutely no fuel in the tank. Eddie's truck kept running on the enigmatic fuel for 3 weeks. He never stopped for diesel and never saw his fuel gauge fall below full while traveling about 5,000 meters across several states. However, there was a cost to the fuel that Eddie was unaware of. He started having intense dreams about the gas station in the desert. I had dreams in which the old attendant would show up and tell Eddie that he had struck a deal he didn't understand, that fuel will last as long as you continue to drive. In Eddie's dreams, the elderly man would explain. However, the fuel will instantly run out if you ever stop trucking and park that rig permanently. It will also take something with it when it leaves. He would see images of other drivers who had been given the enigmatic fuel by the elderly man. Drivers who were compelled to continue driving without a break. The old man said, "There's a convoy of us out there, drivers who struck the same bargain as you." They have been driving for decades and have never been able to retire or halt. Although the gasoline keeps them moving, it also keeps them stuck. On the roadways, Eddie started to notice other trucks, older rigs with drivers who appeared to be moving all the time. When Eddie tried to get a better look, these trucks would disappear after making a fleeting appearance in his mirrors. 3 weeks following his meeting, Eddie came to the understanding. He was receiving more than just free fuel. Some sort of otherworldly transportation corporation was recruiting him, and limitless supply of diesel was exchanged for the freedom of a fleet of drivers. Eddie made a choice that would permanently alter his life. He parked his truck permanently in the yard of his business and gave up hauling. Hours later, his engine stuttered to a halt as his fuel gauge fell to empty. However, as the elderly man had cautioned, the fuel did not simply vanish. Something was taken. Eddie discovered that he was losing the ability to recall specifics of his trucking profession, lost the ability to recognize drivers he had known for years. It wasn't simply his truck that had been supported by the miraculous gasoline. It had been keeping his trucker persona intact. Years of memories and events that shaped Eddie's identity vanished along with the fuel. Having lost most of his recollections of life on the road, Eddie Cortez now works at a loading dock in Los Angeles. He occasionally remembers driving across the nation, but the specifics are hazy. He is aware that he was a truck driver once, but he is unable to recall why he left the industry. Desperate truckers who become stuck in the Mojave Desert can still access the fuel that never runs out. For those who are most in need, the enigmatic station shows up with an offer that looks too good to be true. Additionally, the price is higher than anyone anticipates, as is the case with many offers that look too good to be true. Compensate. In his 23 years as a driver, Frank Morrison had been on all of the country's major highways, but he had never come across a road that headed backward in time. That changed on a snowy January night in 2022, when Frank took what seemed to be a routine detour while transporting medical supplies from Boston to Denver. The issue started close to Syracuse, New York, where Interstate 90 was closed due to a serious collision. Frank had never witnessed state police diverting traffic into a detour route. There was no path on his GPS that matched the detour signs, name of State Route 17B. The traffic was rerouted onto a 2-lane highway that wound through densely forested areas, and Frank followed it. Although there were distinct yellow lines and the road was well maintained, Frank saw that there was no contemporary infrastructure at all. There are thick forests on both sides, but no billboards, electricity wires, or cell towers. All he got on his CB radio was static. His location was displayed by his GPS as a blank area without any roadways. The satellite navigation indicates that he was traveling through terrain that was uninhabited. After traveling for half an hour, Frank started to observe unsettling developments. The trees appeared older and closer together. The snow, which had been falling hard, was lightening, and the readings on his thermometer were increasing. Frank looked at his dashboard clock on January 15th at 11:47 p.m. 2022. However, the snow outside his windshield was melting and giving way to what appeared to be a bright summer evening. Frank could see fireflies blinking in meadows and see stars through clear sky. After stopping, Frank got out. There were crickets and the scent of honeysuckle in the warm, humid air. It appeared as though he had crossed some atmospheric boundary as he turned to face the road again and saw snow falling in the distance. When Frank ascended a hill and spotted a small village in the valley below, it was the first genuine shock. The neighborhood had the appearance of something from the 1950s. Old cars parked along tree-lined lanes, neon signs advertising diners and motels and older structures. Frank observed vintage cars from the 1940s and 1950s as he drove slowly through the town. The price of gasoline at the gas station was 23 cents per gallon. Movie theaters were promoting movies that Frank knew were classics from earlier decades. The folks moved slowly and wore attire from the middle of the 20th century. Some waved at Frank's truck as he went by, as though it were commonplace to see a large rig in their 1950s town. Frank paused at a cafe that was selling the county's best coffee for 5 cents. Inside were period-appropriate servers, a jukebox, playing classic tunes, and red vinyl booths. "Sweetheart, what can I get you?" questioned Betty, a waitress. "Please, just coffee," Frank said. "I take it you're not from here." Large trucks like yours are uncommon on local roads, Frank responded. Cautiously, I'm hauling from Boston to Denver. Due to an accident on the freeway, I had to take a diversion. Interstate? Betty appeared perplexed. An interstate is what? Frank was cold. Small-town residents might not be familiar with the word if this was indeed the 1950s. The primary route. Frank made the correction. There was a collision on the major road. Betty gave a nod. I'm glad you discovered the ancient state road. When Frank used a $5 bill to pay, he got change that included coins he hadn't seen in decades. Because it was a manual cash register, the sale had to be recorded with a handle pull. Frank saw additional proof of time travel as he drove on. Radio stations used broadcasting styles from previous decades while playing songs from that era. He discovered chrome-covered large trucks from the 1950s and 1960s at a truck stop. Frank went over to another trucker with a vintage cap and suspenders. What year is this? Frank inquired. The driver gave him an odd look. 1957. Naturally. Why? What day is it? 23rd July, 1957. How are you feeling, my love? He has gone from winter 2022 to summer 1957, Frank realized. The road was not in the usual time, bridging many historical periods. Frank traveled over landscapes for several hours, alternating between the 1940s, 1930s, and older times. There were fewer and less sophisticated cars, and the architecture grew older. Frank started to fear that he was stuck in some sort of time loop and would have to travel back in time until he arrived at a period before roads. Frank observed a road sign that gave him hope just as his fuel gauge was about to run out. 5 miles on Interstate 80. Following the signs, Frank found himself ascending a lengthy slope through what appeared to be more contemporary landscape. The old cars vanished and were replaced by newer models. Power lines and cell towers resurfaced. Frank was back in the 21st century by the time he arrived to the hill's crest. Frank's GPS abruptly returned to service, indicating that he was close to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Frank felt as though he had just been driving for 3 or 4 hours, but his dashboard clock indicated that 12 hours had elapsed, and the Yahoo system indicated that he had miraculously moved about 200 meters south of where he had entered the enigmatic diversion. The temporal highway's entrance was vanished when Frank attempted to retrace his steps. There was no indication that State Route 17B had ever existed, and the detour signs that had led him onto it were no longer there. After completing his delivery to Denver, Frank started looking into his experience. He discovered sporadic accounts from other truck drivers who detailed comparable experiences with roads that led through several eras, always in places where significant highway building had disrupted historic transit routes. Despite purposefully looking for detours in places where other cars had experienced similar events, Frank never again came across the route to yesterday. He still had the local map Betty gave him, though, and he retained the 1957 coins he got as change at the diner, physical proof that his trip through time had been genuine. Drivers who have fallen upon temporal detours during ordinary highway problems have reported that the path that leads back to yesterday is still out there, by revealing to visitors what life was like in earlier eras when things moved more slowly and the world appeared less confusing. These roadways provide windows into America's past. After 11 years of working as a self-employed truck driver, Bobby Chen got the dispatch call that would put him in a never-ending cycle of deliveries he would never be able to finish. Bobby's phone rang on a misty November morning in 2021 with what appeared to be a standard job offer. "This is Eternal Logistics," a woman's startlingly aloof voice remarked. "Our shipment from Portland to Seattle is of the utmost importance. Are you free?" Bobby was searching for his next job as he was parked at a truck stop in Oregon. The rate was outstanding, and the time was ideal. Almost twice his normal pay for a haul this short. "What's the goods?" Bobby inquired. "Medical supplies," said the dispatcher. "Materials for a research center that must be delivered on time. In Portland, pick up at 1247 Industrial Boulevard. You must arrive by 3 p.m. today." Bobby agreed the work and headed to the address in Portland. He discovered an unremarkable structure devoid any business signage. Except for one trailer that was already loaded and prepared, The loading dock was deserted. A gray uniformed man walked toward Bobby's truck. His eyes seemed to look through Bobby instead of at him, and his complexion was pale. "For the delivery to Seattle, you're here." "Yes, exactly." Chen's Bobby Chen move. Bobby was given a clipboard by the man. "Click here to sign. Under no circumstances should you open the trailer. Deliver to Seattle at 892 Research Drive." Bobby looked at the documents. 42,000 pounds of biological samples were stated in the manifest. Despite its exceptionally quiet operation, the trailer looked to be a typical refrigerated unit. After connecting the trailer, Bobby started traveling north on Interstate 5 toward Seattle. Bobby should have arrived far into Washington state after 2 hours of driving. Rather, he was still in Oregon, close to his starting point, according to the mile markers. His GPS displayed contradicting data. Sometimes you drive in circles, while other times you move closer to Seattle. After stopping, Bobby dialed Eternal Logistics. He clarified, "I'm having navigation problems. My GPS shows inconsistent readings, and I don't seem to be making progress." The dispatcher answered in that same faraway voice, "Keep driving north on Interstate 5. You're getting better. Even after 2 hours of driving, I'm still displaying the same mile markers, even though the delivery needs to be finished. Proceed north on Interstate 5. The delivery needs to be finished." The line died. Bobby kept going north, but the same thing kept happening. The mile marks remained the same no matter how far he drove. His fuel gauge stayed at precisely the same level, and the scenery kept the same. Bobby attempted phoning different businesses, but each number led him to the same Eternal Logistics employee. Proceed north on Interstate 5. The delivery needs to be finished. Bobby became aware that he was caught in an impossible cycle as darkness fell. After 8 hours of driving, he had not made any discernible progress. He was continuously passing the same sites even though his odometer indicated that he had traveled more than 400 meters. Bobby made the decision to examine his cargo. He opened the trailer doors in spite of the warnings. With the exception of a tiny metal box positioned in the middle, the trailer was entirely empty. A gadget of some sort. There was a faint blue light coming from the device, and it was humming faintly. Bobby heard noises from within as he got closer. Dozens of voices, all speaking simultaneously. Proceed north on Interstate 5. The delivery needs to be finished. Bobby recognized the voices as those of other truck drivers who had taken Eternal Logistics supplies. They were all stuck in the same never-ending cycle, traveling indefinitely in the direction of unachievable goals. Bobby's hands went straight through the apparatus, which seemed to be made of light, despite his attempts to smash it. The voices became louder and more demanding that he go back to his truck and yelling his name. The voice said, "You can't escape," rather plainly. "You drive until the end of time after accepting a dispatch from Eternal Logistics. Some of us have been drivers for decades. The journey never stops." The coupling mechanism would not disengage. When Bobby rushed back to his truck and attempted to detach the trailer, his truck was permanently bonded to it. His phone only connected to Eternal Logistics when he attempted to dial 911. Proceed north on Interstate 5. The delivery needs to be finished. All Bobby could do was keep driving. He started noticing additional lorries on the roadway as the hours went by. Numerous large rigs, they all had comparable unmarked trailers and were moving in the same way. Bobby received only the repeated message when he tried to use his CB radio to signal other drivers. Bobby became aware that he was now a member of a trucker phantom convoy that was stuck in an endless logistics cycle. On a highway that led nowhere, they traveled through an unending night, seeking deliveries that would never be made, transporting goods that did not exist. As Bobby repeatedly drove through the same stretch of roadway, the days turned into weeks. His truck never broke down, never needed fuel, and never had any wear. No matter what mysterious force held him captive, he never went hungry or tired. Bobby made every effort to get away. Unseen obstacles kept him from veering off the highway when he tried to do so. The engine would restart itself when he attempted to stop. He attempted to walk away from his truck, but within minutes, he was back behind the wheel. Bobby discovered that Eternal Logistics was a phony business. It was a supernatural being that thrived on the truckers' constant movement while they were stuck. in order to attract independent drivers seeking well-paying jobs who would refrain from asking too many questions. The dispatches were bait. The entity's power came from keeping truckers moving constantly, pursuing deliveries that served mainly as psychological incentives to keep driving. The drivers joined a supernatural engine that propelled an incomprehensible entity. Bobby Chen and dozens of other truckers who responded to the incorrect dispatch call are stuck in an endless circle on Interstate 5 as they continue to drive north. Every day his vehicle travels by the same mile markers while towing an empty trailer in the direction of an imaginary location. On occasion, other truck drivers claim to have seen the Phantom Convoy, which is a line of trucks traveling in perfect formation over fog-covered I-5 segments, their drivers gazing straight ahead with blank faces. The trucks disappear when approached, and these sightings are invariably at night. The never-ending dispatch is still looking for more drivers. Eternal Logistics calls independent drivers with minimal qualifications and high-paying gigs. They are occupations that look too good to be true. However, drivers are already stuck in the never-ending convoy when they discover their error.